All right, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Assistant Chief Richard Del Toro, and I'm also here as Sergeant Robert Fontaine from our Criminal Investigations Division, the Port St. Lucie Police Department. I want to thank you for attending this afternoon to discuss the deadly shooting of a 15-year-old victim that occurred this past weekend. First, I'd like to extend our thoughts and prayers to the family and friends of the victim. It's a tragedy anytime we experience a loss of life, but especially when the victim's a juvenile and around this holiday season. I want to thank our officers, our detectives and staff for their initial response and follow-up this past weekend that was able to bring this to a successful conclusion. But I want to go ahead and read a prepared statement and then go ahead and take any questions everyone may have or anything anybody has. But on December 17, 2021, at approximately 11:38 p.m., officers were dispatched to the area of Crosstown Parkway and U.S. Highway 1. The caller and one of the occupants of the vehicle called to report someone had been shot inside of the vehicle, and the caller further indicated they were driving to the hospital. While traveling south on US 1, the vehicle struck another vehicle at the intersection of Southeast Tiffany Avenue. The vehicle eventually became disabled near the intersection of Southeast Tiffany Avenue and Southeast Hillmore Drive. Officers arrived at that location and discovered the victim laying outside of the vehicle with a single gunshot wound to the chest. The suspect, victim, and 2 additional occupants of the vehicle were also on scene. Officers began life-saving measures, and the victim was soon transported by rescue to the hospital, where the victim was pronounced deceased. The suspect and another occupant of the vehicle were also transported to the hospital due to minor injuries from the vehicle crash. The driver of the other vehicle had minor injuries and was not transported to the hospital. The investigation has revealed that the victim and suspect knew each other and had been together in Fort Pierce earlier in the day. The victim and suspect were later picked up in Fort Pierce by the other 2 occupants and were traveling to Jensen Beach. The suspect entered the vehicle with a zippered bag that contained a firearm, and the victim also entered the vehicle with a second zippered bag that also contained another firearm. The suspect was seated in the rear driver's side passenger seat, and the victim was seated in the rear passenger side seat. While traveling in the vehicle, the suspect was handed a magazine from the victim, at which time the suspect unzipped the bag, reached in to pull the firearm out, but he negligently mishandled the firearm by pulling the trigger. A round was discharged from the handgun, striking the victim once in the left side of the chest. The bullet traveled through the chest area and exited the right side of the chest and was later recovered in the vehicle by our crime scene technicians. We believe this shooting occurred near the intersection of Southeast Crosstown Parkway and Southeast Oroso Boulevard. The suspect then handed the gun to the driver, and the gun was placed on the driver's side floorboard. The suspect then threw a magazine that he was handed by the victim out of the vehicle window in the area of Southeast Crosstown Parkway and Southeast Oroso Boulevard. The magazine was later found by our K-9 unit several hours later after searching the area. The driver of the vehicle then drove towards US 1 towards the hospital, but following the crash, the suspect exited the vehicle, grabbed the handgun involved in the shooting from the floorboard and the other gun the victim had, and the suspect disposed of both firearms across the street and into the grass area in an effort to hide the firearms. Once the guns were across the street, the suspect went back to check on the victim. Officers later detained the suspect, and he was taken to the station for an interview after receiving medical clearance at the hospital. During a follow-up interview, the suspect confessed to the shooting, and the suspect also stated that he obtained the firearms from the victim. 2 firearms were recovered at the scene. One was a Glock 9mm handgun that we believe was the one that was involved in the shooting, and the other was a 9mm Ruger. Both firearms were reported stolen out of unincorporated St. Lucie County, and the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office is aware of our recovery of those firearms and is actively following up on those 2 cases. The suspect is identified as Brian Hurlburt, Hurlburt, 17 years old, date of birth 10/27 of 2004. And he has been charged with aggravated manslaughter of a child, tampering with physical evidence, carrying a concealed firearm, unlawfully possessing a firearm by a person under the age of 18, and he was later transported to the St. Lucie County Juvenile Detention Center. And with that, I'll take any questions anybody may have.
Who do the guns belong to?
2 different owners of those guns. They were stolen in 2 separate incidents, but I'm not going to reveal those names. I'd rather refer that to the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office since it's their investigation.
It wasn't like a parent's gun or someone in a family household that they could have easily obtained it, or
Not-
they were stolen from somewhere else?
Not that we believe, no.
Okay.
How many people in total were in the vehicle at the time of the shooting? Were there 4?
Including the victim, 4.
Have you had any run-ins with these juveniles prior to this incident?
They've had run-ins with the law. The suspect did have a prior criminal history, I believe including criminal mischief, resisting an officer with violence, battery on a law enforcement officer, and felony violation of probation.
Where do you think this car full of people was headed? Were they going to commit crimes? Why did they have the guns with them? Have you guys been able to kind of figure out what their intentions were that day?
According to the interviews we had, they were traveling to see another person in Jensen Beach. Whether or not they were going to commit any crimes is going to be determined as part of our follow-up investigation.
What was the demeanor of the suspect? Was he remorseful for what had happened, being that he had a relationship with the victim?
I'd actually refer that to Sergeant Fontaine.
He was cooperative. He did express some remorse toward the end of our encounter with him, but overall he complied with all of our requests and cooperated with the investigation.
Can you explain a little bit more about how the actual gun went off and like in that process, what you guys know?
Yeah, so from what we know, as I said before, the suspect was seated in the rear passenger seat behind the driver. The victim was in the rear passenger seat behind the passenger side. So it's basically suspect, victim. Suspect alleges he was handed a magazine for the handgun from the victim, at which time he opened up a zippered, kind of like a fanny pack type bag, reached in to grab the handgun and negligently pulled the trigger, firing the round into the victim, into the left side of the chest, and it exited out the right.
Being that you said this was an accidental discharge of a weapon, how did that kind of influence what the charges would be versus like a first-degree murder, second-degree murder?
I don't like to say it's accidental. I'd say negligent,
Okay.
because anytime you handle a firearm, it should be with care. First of all, no juvenile should even be in possession of a firearm. But the fact that he mishandled it is negligent, and that's how we came up with the charge for manslaughter, because it is culpable negligence, which leads to the charge.
I had a question.
Yes, sir.
On the affidavit, it said that a 17-year-old black male had been shot, but I believe it was stated earlier that it was a 15-year-old. Just wanted to clarify, what's that age?
Yeah, that was the initial information the detectives received, but it was later determined to be a 15-year-old victim.
Are you releasing the victim's name?
No, we're not at this time.
What do you say, because you're a father, you know, no parent should get this news even days before the Christmas holiday. It's the first day of the holiday release for, you know, St. Lucie County Schools, and here we have this tragic shooting, even though it involves some kids who probably were up to no good. I mean, these families are forever changed now.
Yeah, it is a tragedy. I mean, and kids do things that they shouldn't do, but anytime it results in a loss of life is just tragic for any parent to have to live through. So I spoke to a family member earlier and just expressed our condolences. They're still trying to process this and going through, obviously, the initial grieving process itself. But we're going to do whatever we can for the victim and the family, and just to make sure they get the support that they need. But I think the lesson taken from this is that we just need to be aware as much as we can what our kids are doing, what they're involved with, making sure we're having conversations with them if they do come across any type of weapon, especially a handgun, to handle with due care, to notify a responsible adult that knows what to do with those type of weapons and firearms.
The weapons that they had, were they reported stolen? Like, were they stolen out of someone's home? Were they stolen out of a vehicle?
Again,
Did you have any of that?
I do know, I will confirm both guns were reported stolen in separate incidents, but they were both out of unincorporated St. Lucie County. They had been reported to the St. Lucie County Sheriff's Office, so I'd much rather I don't want to speak on their behalf and let them comment.
Did they get into a single car accident near the hospital, or did they collide with another vehicle with another person?
I believe it was with another vehicle. I believe. I'm not 100% sure. Do we know that?
Yeah, it was with another car.
Vehicle. As they turned, they were heading south on US 1, made a left turn out to Tiffany, heading east towards the hospital where the accident occurred, and the vehicle became disabled at Hillmore and Tiffany Avenue.
How bad was that accident? Was it like a, fender bender, or?
The other driver was treated at the scene and released. They had minor injuries, and they were released from the scene.
So following the accident, they kept driving?
Right now, it's
Stop.
within several feet, the vehicle became disabled. And from what we understand, the driver of the vehicle ran to the hospital to seek help, because obviously there's a delay when there's a report of an accident, and they were trying to get the victim to the hospital as quick as possible. And by the time he came back and couldn't access the front door to the hospital because it was late at night and the front lobbies obviously closed at the hospital, officers and paramedics were already arriving on scene.
They didn't call 911?
They called 911 right after the shooting. Yeah,
Okay.
they did. But they just thought it was quicker, I believe, to drive to the hospital.
Could we see more charges for the driver or anybody else in the vehicle?
That's going to be up to the state attorney. Once the case is finally closed, and they'll determine what the appropriate charges will be if any other people are involved.
And you said there were 2 other people in the vehicle, correct? Or how many others?
There was a driver, passenger, our suspect, and victim for a total of 4.
Gotcha. And then, do you have the ages of the other people in the car?
I'm not going to release that at this time. They're witnesses involved in a homicide, so they're protected for a couple of years. So I'm going to just keep that under wraps right now.
And the gender of the victim, you're not gonna.
I'm not going to release that at this time, sorry.
Did you mention where the place of residence was for the victim and the suspect you have in custody right now?
The suspect is out of Fort Pierce. The victim, I'm not going to release that at this time.
You said when paramedics showed up, the victim was already out on the ground. Do you think that was was he trying to get to the hospital? Do you think his friends were trying to do CPR on him? Why was he out of the vehicle?
Might have just got out after the accident, but officers, once they arrived on scene, were trying to do life-saving measures until paramedics took over and they transported him as fast as possible. But probably, once the car was disabled, everyone got out of the vehicle. Any other questions?
Were drugs involved at all?
To my knowledge, not that I know of, no.
And with the firearms in possession of within the car, I'm sorry if you mentioned this earlier, was it in the possession of the suspect, or was it the passengers, the other people in the car?
The gun that discharged was in the possession of the suspect.
Mm-hmm.
We believe the victim was in possession of another firearm in a separate bag.
Right, and both of them had brought them in the car.
Correct.
Okay.
Are you able to say how the victim and suspect know each other? Do they go to school together? Are they neighborhood friends? Are they?
We believe they know each other from school,
And where do they go to school?
Port St. Lucie High School.